The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Laura Mendez's Austin apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor where she stood, barefoot and still, staring at the number on the scale, 145 pounds. 5 years ago, that same scale had displayed 295 pounds, and the woman looking down at it had been someone she barely recognized anymore. Laura ran her fingers through her dark hair, now streaked with premature grey from the stress of transformation, and remembered how different mornings used to feel. Back then, stepping on the scale had been an act of self-punishment, a ritual of shame performed in the pre-dawn darkness when no one, not even the sun, could witness her disappointment. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, filling the apartment with the familiar aroma of dark roast mixed with cinnamon, a habit she'd picked up from her grandmother in Belo Horizonte. Laura padded toward the kitchen, her body moving with an ease that still surprised her sometimes. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and paused, not out of vanity, but out of habit, checking to see if the person staring back was real. The woman in the mirror had defined cheekbones, collarbones that actually showed, and arms that didn't hide beneath oversized cardigans anymore. Yet sometimes, in moments of vulnerability, she still saw the ghost of her former self overlapping this new image, like a double-exposure photograph that refused to fully develop. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Marcus, her running partner. "Trail at 6:30. Weather's perfect." She typed back a quick confirmation, then scrolled through her social media feed while the coffee brewed. A memory popped up from 6 years ago, a photo from her cousin's wedding in Brazil. In it, she stood at the edge of the group, her body angled to hide behind others, wearing a black dress that she'd convinced herself was slimming, but now realized had only emphasized how uncomfortable she'd been in her own skin. The smile in that photo didn't reach her eyes. It never did back then. Laura poured her coffee into a ceramic mug, decorated with the Texas flag, a gift from her co-worker Jennifer, who'd become one of her closest friends during this journey. She remembered their first real conversation 3 years ago, when Jennifer had found her crying in the office bathroom after someone had made a comment about her bringing salad for lunch again. "Don't they get it?" Laura had sobbed, mascara running down her cheeks. "They think it's about vanity. They think I'm trying to be better than them, but I'm just trying to survive each day without going back to who I was." The apartment felt different now than it had 5 years ago. Back then, it had been a fortress of isolation, delivery containers piling up by the door, curtains drawn against the world. Now, her running shoes sat by the entrance next to a yoga mat, and fresh vegetables filled the crisper drawer where frozen pizzas once dominated. The transformation wasn't just physical, it had required renovating her entire life, one small choice at a time. She'd learned that weight loss was the easiest part. The real challenge was the daily decision to remain the person she'd fought to become. Her mother called from Brazil, as she did every Sunday morning. "Lourinha, meu amor, how are you?" The familiar Portuguese wrapped around her like a warm embrace. They talked about trivial things at first, her mother updating her about the neighbors, the weather in Belo Horizonte, her father's new obsession with growing tomatoes. Then, inevitably, the conversation turned to food. "Are you eating enough? You're not starving yourself, are you?" Her mother's concern was genuine but loaded with cultural weight. In Brazilian culture, food was love, celebration, comfort. Laura had spent years untangling those associations, learning to separate nourishment from emotion without losing her cultural identity entirely. "I'm eating well, Mai. I made feijoada yesterday, but with turkey sausage instead of pork." There was a pause on the other end, and Laura could practically hear her mother's skepticism. This was the dance they did now, her mother trying to understand this new version of her daughter who counted calories and ran marathons, who traded family recipes for modified versions that fit her macros. It wasn't rejection of her heritage, Laura wanted to explain, but rather a renegotiation of it. She was still Brazilian, still her mother's daughter, but she'd learned to love herself enough to make choices that her family didn't always understand. After the call, Laura prepared for her run, laying out her clothes with the precision of someone who'd learned that preparation was half the battle. The sports bra that had once seemed impossibly small, the running shorts that showed legs made strong through thousands of miles, the moisture-wicking shirt that clung to a body she'd earned through sweat and determination. Each piece of clothing was a small victory, a tangible reminder of how far she'd come. She remembered the first time she'd walked into a regular clothing store after losing the weight, how she'd cried in the dressing room when a size medium had fit, how the saleswoman had found her sobbing and thought something was wrong when everything was finally right. The drive to the trail took her through downtown Austin, past the barbecue joints and food trucks that had once been her weakness and were now just part of the landscape. She'd learned to coexist with temptation, to acknowledge it without surrendering to it. The key wasn't avoiding these places entirely, but changing her relationship with them. She could enjoy Franklin barbecue on special occasions without it triggering a spiral. She could have queso at Torchy's Tacos without ordering 3 additional tacos for later that would be gone within an hour. These small victories might seem insignificant to others, but to Laura, they were monuments to her willpower. Marcus was already at the trailhead, stretching against his truck. He'd been part of her journey for 3 years now, initially just a colleague who'd invited her to join the company running club, now one of her closest confidants. He was one of the few people who understood that her transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, that every day required conscious choice and effort. "You look strong today," he said, and she appreciated that he said strong, not thin. The distinction mattered more than most people realized. As they began their run along the Butler Hike and Bike Trail, the morning air cool against her skin, Laura felt the familiar rhythm of her breath syncing with her footsteps. This was her meditation, her therapy, her daily reminder that her body was capable of extraordinary things when she asked it to be. 5 years ago, she couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without getting winded. Now she was training for her 3rd half marathon. The path wound along Lady Bird Lake, and she watched the sunrise paint the water gold, feeling grateful for this moment, this body, this life she'd built from the ruins of her former self. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new temptations, new reasons to doubt herself. But today, in this moment, she was exactly who she'd fought to become. The conference room at Henderson Marketing felt arctic as Laura presented the quarterly social media analytics to the executive team. She'd worn her best blazer, the navy one that had cost more than she used to spend on clothes in 6 months, but underneath, anxiety pooled like cold water in her stomach. It wasn't the presentation making her nervous, it was the lunch meeting afterward. Company celebrations had become minefields since her transformation, each one a careful navigation between maintaining her progress and not appearing antisocial or worse, judgmental of others' choices. "Excellent work, Laura," David Henderson, the CEO, said as she concluded. "You've really transformed our digital presence." The word transformed hung in the air, and she wondered if he meant more than just the company's Instagram engagement rates. People often spoke to her in metaphors now, as if her physical transformation had turned her into a walking motivational poster. She smiled and thanked him, gathering her materials as everyone filtered out toward the catered lunch in the main conference hall. The spread was elaborate: barbecue brisket, mac and cheese, cornbread, pecan pie. Austin business lunches were notorious for their excess, and she could feel her old self stirring at the sight of it all. That version of Laura would have loaded her plate under the guise of not wanting to appear rude, then gone back for seconds because the food was there and free, and because eating in public had always been a performance of not caring what others thought while caring desperately. Now she selected carefully: brisket without the sauce, salad, a small portion of coleslaw. She could feel eyes on her choices, or maybe that was just her projection. After 5 years, she still couldn't tell the difference. Jennifer sat beside her, her own plate laden with everything Laura had avoided. "God, I shouldn't be eating this," she said, then took a large bite of cornbread. It was a dance Laura knew well, the public self-flagellation over food choices that served as both confession and permission. She wanted to tell Jennifer that she didn't need to perform this ritual, at least not for her, but she'd learned that her transformation made others uncomfortable with their own choices. Her existence had become an unintended mirror, reflecting back people's relationships with their bodies and food. "So 5 years, Robert from accounting said, approaching their table. He'd been making comments about her weight loss since year 2, always dancing on the edge of appropriate. "What's your secret? Still doing that whole thing?" That whole thing. As if maintaining a 150-pound weight loss was a hobby she'd picked up, like scrapbooking or golf. Laura set down her fork carefully, a technique she'd learned to give herself time to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. "There's no secret, Robert, just consistency." She kept her voice level, professional. What she didn't say was that the secret was waking up every morning and choosing to be this version of herself, even when her body screamed for the comfort of old patterns. The secret was crying in her car after particularly hard days, but not driving to Whataburger. The secret was therapy, support groups, and a relationship with food so carefully reconstructed that sometimes she felt like an architect of her own appetite. After lunch, she escaped to the bathroom, a habit she'd developed not to purge but to breathe. The mirror showed a professional woman, put together and confident, but Laura saw the exhaustion underneath. Maintaining weight loss was a full-time job that no one paid her for, a constant performance of normalcy around food that left her drained. Her phone buzzed with a notification from her fitness app. "You haven't logged your lunch yet." She closed the app without entering anything. Some days, the tracking felt like freedom. Other days, it felt like prison. The afternoon dragged with meetings and emails, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. She had a date with Thomas, someone she'd met at her gym 3 months ago. Dating had become another complexity she hadn't anticipated when she'd started losing weight. There was the question of when to reveal her past. The photos she kept hidden, the loose skin she camouflaged with carefully chosen clothing. Some men fetishized her transformation, seeing her as a project or a testament to their ability to appreciate real beauty. Others seemed threatened by her discipline, as if her control over her body implied judgment of their own habits. She drove home through rush-hour traffic, NPR discussing the obesity epidemic on the radio. The expert talked about environmental factors, food deserts, the complexity of weight loss, and she wanted to call in and scream that knowing the complexity didn't make living it any easier. Her apartment building's gym was packed when she arrived, the after-work crowd claiming every treadmill. This was another thing no one told you about maintenance. It required constant planning, backup plans for backup plans. She changed into workout clothes and headed back out to run the neighborhood loop she'd mapped for exactly these situations. The run cleared her head, as it always did. 3 miles at a steady pace, not pushing for speed or distance, just moving to remind herself that her body was hers to command. She passed other runners, exchanging the brief nods of solidarity that made her feel part of something larger. A woman pushing a jogging stroller gave her a thumbs up, and Laura remembered being inspired by fit mothers when she'd started, thinking if they could do it with kids, she had no excuse. Now she wondered if that mother saw her as inspiration or just another runner. The shift in perspective still caught her off guard. Back home, she showered and dressed for the date, choosing jeans that showed her figure without clinging to the loose skin on her thighs, a flowing top that suggested her shape without revealing too much. Thomas had made reservations at an Italian restaurant, which sent a familiar spike of anxiety through her chest. Italian meant pasta, bread, wine, all the things she could have in moderation, but which required mental mathematics that exhausted her. She practiced her order in her head: Grilled fish if they had it, chicken masala without the pasta, a side salad with dressing on the side. The mental rehearsal was another secret nobody knew about. The pre-gaming required to appear naturally healthy rather than obsessively controlled. Thomas picked her up in his truck, country music playing softly on the radio. He was handsome in that specifically Austin way. Beard, flannel shirt, craft beer enthusiast. He'd been patient with her food quirks so far, but she knew eventually he'd want to share appetizers, split desserts, have those intimate moments over food that defined so much of dating culture. "You look beautiful," he said, and she thanked him, pushing down the voice that whispered he wouldn't have looked twice at her 5 years ago. The restaurant was crowded and warm, the smell of garlic and baking bread almost overwhelming. Their table was near the kitchen, and she watched plates of creamy pasta float by, like ships she could no longer board. Thomas ordered easily, unself-consciously. Lasagna, a beer, yes to the bread basket. She ordered her grilled salmon with steamed vegetables, water with lemon, and saw the waiter's slight pause, the look that said she was that kind of customer. Thomas reached for her hand across the table, and she let him take it, even though part of her wanted to explain that she wasn't naturally thin, that this was work, constant work, and she was so tired of working. "Tell me about Brazil," he said, and she relaxed slightly. This was safer ground, talking about her childhood in Belo Horizonte, the mountains, the food. She caught herself then, realizing she was describing meals she could no longer eat, flavors that lived now only in memory. Her grandmother's pão de queijo, her mother's brigadeiros, the feijoada that took all day to cook and brought the entire family together. Food had been love in her culture, and sometimes she felt like she'd had to choose between her heritage and her health. "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked, and she knew he meant Brazil, but she heard, "Do you miss eating?" The answer to both was yes, desperately sometimes. She missed the simplicity of eating without thought, the joy of food without calculation. She missed her family understanding her choices, missed not having to explain why she'd changed recipes that had been passed down for generations. But mostly, she missed not having to think about any of it, the privilege of unconscious consumption she'd given up forever. "I miss parts of it," she said finally. And that was true enough. Thomas squeezed her hand, and she could tell he wanted to understand, but didn't quite know what he was trying to understand. The waiter brought their food, and she ate slowly, deliberately, tasting every bite because she'd learned that mindful eating was the only way to feel satisfied with less. Thomas offered her a bite of his lasagna, and she declined with a smile that she hoped looked natural rather than practiced. He didn't push, and she added that to the mental list of things she liked about him. After dinner, he drove her home, the Austin skyline glittering in the distance. "I'd like to see you again," he said at her door, and she agreed, even though she knew that eventually he'd want to cook for her, to share popcorn at movies, to have lazy Sunday brunches that would require her to explain why she couldn't just relax and enjoy food like a normal person. But tonight, she kissed him goodnight and went inside alone, where she could finally drop the performance of ease she'd been maintaining all day. In the darkness of her apartment, she sat on her couch and cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from exhaustion. Tomorrow she'd wake up and do it all again. This elaborate dance of maintenance that looked like success from the outside, but felt like survival from within. 5 years down, she thought, a lifetime to go. The support group met in the basement of St. David's Episcopal Church every Wednesday evening, fluorescent lights flickering over a circle of mismatched chairs that had held countless stories of struggle and triumph. Laura arrived early, as she always did, helping Margaret set up the coffee station with its array of herbal teas and sugar-free options. This room had become her sanctuary over the past 4 years, the one place where she didn't have to explain or defend her choices, where everyone understood that maintaining weight loss was not a destination, but a daily decision that required constant vigilance. "How was your week?" Margaret asked, her 70-year-old hands steady as she arranged cups. Margaret had lost 90 pounds 15 years ago and was the group's unofficial elder, proof that long-term success was possible. Laura admired her deeply, but also feared becoming her, someone whose entire identity had crystallized around a number on a scale, who could recite her starting weight, goal weight, and current weight like a prayer. Challenging, Laura admitted, then told her about the work lunch, the date, the constant mental calculations that left her exhausted. Margaret nodded knowingly. She'd heard variations of this story countless times, from countless people, all of them learning that the after was harder than the during. The during has an end point, Margaret often said. The after is forever. People began filtering in for the 7 o'clock meeting. There was James, who'd lost 200 pounds and gained back 50, but was fighting to stop the slide. Sarah, 3 months into her journey and still glowing with the honeymoon phase of rapid loss. Marcus arrived, giving Laura a supportive nod. He'd started coming after she'd mentioned how helpful it was, and his presence had become a comfort, someone who knew her in both worlds. Tonight's topic was navigating social situations, and Laura found herself sharing more than usual. She talked about the work lunch, how Robert's comments made her feel like a specimen rather than a person. She described the exhaustion of constantly modulating her food choices to appear neither obsessive nor careless. "I feel like I'm performing health rather than living it," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Like I have to be the perfect success story, or I'm letting everyone down." "Including yourself?" Dr. Patricia Chen, the group's facilitator, asked gently. She was a therapist who specialized in weight-related issues, and her questions had a way of cutting through to the heart of things. Laura considered this, realizing that her harshest critic wasn't Robert or the waiter or even Thomas. It was the voice in her head that monitored every bite, every choice, every moment of weakness with ruthless precision. "Especially myself," Laura admitted. "I'm terrified that if I relax even a little, I'll wake up back where I started. Sometimes I have dreams where I've gained all the weight back overnight, and I wake up in a panic, running to the mirror to make sure I'm still this." She gestured at her body, still struggling to find the right words for what this was. Sarah, still new enough to be optimistic, asked, "But doesn't it get easier? Once you've maintained for 5 years, isn't it just habit?" The room fell silent. Everyone who'd been at this longer than a year knowing the answer, but not wanting to crush her hope. It was Laura who finally spoke. "It becomes familiar, but not easier. It's like, imagine you moved to a foreign country where you had to speak a second language all the time. After 5 years, you'd be fluent, but you'd still be translating in your head. You'd still be working harder than native speakers. That's what this feels like. I'm fluent in healthy living, but it's not my native language." After the meeting, a few of them went to a nearby diner, a tradition that had developed over the years. The diner knew them now, didn't blink when they asked for modifications, substitutions, dressing on the side. Laura ordered her usual, a Greek salad with grilled chicken, and felt grateful for this small circle where her choices required no explanation or apology. Marcus sat beside her, and she noticed he'd been quieter than usual during the meeting. "You okay?" she asked, and he laughed ruefully. "I was going to ask you the same thing. Your share tonight, it hit hard." They'd become close enough to have these conversations, to acknowledge the difficulty without trying to fix it with platitudes. "I'm tired," she admitted. "Not of the work itself, but of having to make it look effortless. People want the success story, the before and after, but they don't want to hear that the after photo is just one moment in an ongoing struggle. They don't want to know that I weigh myself every morning, that I track every bite, that I plan my meals a week in advance. They want magic, not method." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Laura's mind kept circling back to a realization that had been building for months. She'd lost the weight to find freedom, to escape the prison of her body. But she'd traded one form of confinement for another. The prison was prettier now, more socially acceptable, but it was still a cage built from calorie counts and workout schedules, from constant vigilance and the fear of returning to who she used to be. Thursday morning arrived grey and humid, a spring storm building over Austin. Laura's morning run was cancelled due to lightning warnings, throwing off her entire routine. This was another thing people didn't understand, how disruption to her schedule felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Exercise wasn't just about burning calories, it was her mood regulator, her stress relief, her daily proof that she was still committed to this version of herself. She did a workout video in her living room instead, jumping jacks muffled by her downstairs neighbor's complaints, but it wasn't the same. By the time she got to work, she was irritable and unsettled. The day only got worse when she opened her email to find a message from her mother with photos from her cousin Anna's birthday party in Belo Horizonte. Everyone looked happy, gathered around tables laden with traditional foods, and Laura felt a sharp pang of homesickness mixed with relief that she wasn't there to navigate the food and the questions about why she wasn't eating more. Jennifer stopped by her desk around lunch. "Want to grab burgers? There's a new place that opened up." Laura declined, citing meal prep she'd brought, and saw the flash of something in Jennifer's eyes. Hurt, judgment, or just Laura's own projection? This was the calculus she did constantly, weighing social connection against caloric intake, friendship against fitness goals. That afternoon, she had a meeting with a potential new client, a local fitness studio wanting to revamp their social media presence. The owner, a preternaturally thin woman named Kristin, looked at Laura appraisingly. "You work out, obviously," she said, and Laura felt the familiar discomfort of being seen only as a body. "I love that. You'll understand our brand." Laura wanted to tell her that she understood the brand too well, that fitness had become both her salvation and her master, but instead she smiled and discussed engagement rates and content calendars. On her way home, she stopped at Whole Foods, her weekly shopping trip planned with military precision. She had her list, organized by store layout to minimize browsing time and temptation. But today, standing in front of the bakery case, she felt a pull so strong it was almost physical. The chocolate croissants gleamed under the lights, and she could taste them, remember them from before when food was pleasure instead of problem. She stood there long enough that an employee asked if she needed help, and she fled, leaving her half-full cart behind. In her car, she called Margaret, who answered on the second ring as if she'd been expecting the call. "I almost broke," Laura said without preamble. 5 years, and I stood there staring at croissants like they were salvation. Margaret's voice was calm, understanding. "But you didn't break. You called me instead. That's what success looks like, honey. Not the absence of temptation, but choosing differently when it comes." That evening, Thomas texted about weekend plans. He wanted to take her to Salt Lick, the famous barbecue place in Driftwood. All you can eat, family style, a Texas tradition. Laura stared at the message for a long time, crafting and deleting responses. How could she explain that all you can eat was her kryptonite? That the abundance would trigger something primal in her that 5 years of work hadn't fully tamed? In the end, she suggested an alternative, a hiking date followed by a picnic she'd prepare. He agreed, but she wondered how many more modifications he'd accept before deciding she was too complicated. She spent the rest of the evening meal prepping for the week, weighing chicken breasts, portioning out vegetables, filling containers with precise servings that would remove the need for decisions when she was tired or stressed. This was her life now, she thought, watching the food scale's digital display. Everything measured, contained, controlled. She'd wanted to lose weight to feel free, but freedom looked different than she'd imagined. It looked like protein shakes and food scales, like workout schedules and support group meetings, like constant vigilance against an enemy that lived inside her own body. Before bed, she stood in front of her full-length mirror, something she'd avoided for years when she was heavy but now did nightly, checking for signs of backsliding. Her body was smaller, stronger, healthier by every metric that mattered. But sometimes she missed the simplicity of being fat when the problem was obvious, and the solution seemed clear. Now she was solving for an equation that never resolved, maintaining a balance that required constant adjustment. 5 years in, and she was only beginning to understand that this wasn't a journey with a destination. It was a migration to a new country where she'd always be a foreigner, speaking a language she'd learned but would never be native to. The key to long-term success, she was learning, wasn't finding ease, but accepting the effort. Not reaching a finish line, but learning to find joy in the endless race. The Austin Marathon Health Expo buzzed with energy on a Friday afternoon in February as Laura walked through the exhibitor booths with Marcus and 3 other members from their running club. 5 years and 2 months since she'd started her transformation, and here she was, picking up her bib for a half marathon, something that would have seemed like pure fantasy in her former life. The expo was overwhelming in its celebration of fitness. Vendors selling everything from compression socks to electrolyte drinks, all promising to optimize performance. Laura found herself both drawn to and repelled by it all, this commodification of health that she'd bought into completely, yet somehow still questioned. "You nervous?" Marcus asked as they stopped at a booth demonstrating foam rollers. She was nervous, but not about the race. Tomorrow would mark another milestone, not just the half marathon, but also meeting Thomas's parents who were driving in from Houston to watch him run the full marathon. 6 months of dating had led to this moment, and she'd been dreading it for weeks. Meeting parents meant questions about her past, about her family, about the person she used to be, before she'd carefully reconstructed herself into someone acceptable. That evening, she stood in her closet, agonizing over what to wear to dinner with Thomas's family. Everything felt wrong, too tight or too loose, too much or not enough. She finally settled on a wrap dress that Jennifer had helped her pick out, one that showed she had a figure without revealing the loose skin that remained, despite all her work. The mirror reflected back a put-together woman, but Laura saw all the flaws, the places where her transformation remained incomplete. Thomas picked her up, excited and oblivious to her anxiety. "They're going to love you," he said, squeezing her hand as they drove to the restaurant. His parents had chosen a steakhouse because of course they had. Texas parents always chose steakhouses, places where the portions were enormous and the expectation was indulgence. Laura had already looked up the menu online, planned her order, calculated the calories. This was her life now, every meal a strategic operation. His parents were warm, welcoming people who immediately started asking questions. His mother, Patricia, was particularly interested in Laura's background. "Thomas tells us you're from Brazil. How wonderful. The food must be so different here." Laura smiled, launching into her practiced explanation of how she'd adapted to American cuisine, leaving out the part about how she'd had to relearn how to eat entirely, how food had become math rather than culture. "And what do you do to stay in such great shape?" his father Bill asked as the appetizers arrived, fried calamari and loaded potato skins that Thomas and his parents dug into enthusiastically. "You're both running tomorrow, right?" Laura took a small piece of calamari, placing it on her plate but not eating it immediately, a trick she'd learned to appear participatory without actually participating. "I run, yes, and I watch what I eat." It was a non-answer that usually satisfied people, but Patricia leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Oh, I need to do that. I've been trying to lose these last 20 pounds forever." "What's your secret?" There it was again, the assumption that there was a secret, a trick, something beyond the grinding daily discipline that had consumed her life for 5 years. Thomas interrupted before she could answer, telling his parents about her transformation, showing them a before photo from her Facebook that she'd forgotten was still visible. She watched their faces change as they processed the information, saw the woman in the photo versus the woman sitting before them. 150 pounds, Patricia exclaimed. "That's incredible. You must have such willpower." Laura felt exposed, naked despite being fully clothed. This was why she rarely told people about her past, because once they knew, she became a different creature in their eyes. Not just Laura, but Laura who used to be fat. Every bite she took or didn't take would now be scrutinized through that lens. She was no longer just Thomas's girlfriend, but a transformation story, a testimony to willpower, a walking before and after photo. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Laura struggled to focus. She ordered her planned meal, grilled chicken with steamed vegetables, and endured Patricia's comments about how good she was being, how she wished she had that kind of discipline. Bill told a long story about his college football days, and Thomas talked about his marathon training. Laura smiled and nodded, but inside she was calculating how early she could leave, how many hours until she could be alone with her carefully controlled environment. That night, she barely slept. Anxiety about the race mixing with replayed moments from dinner. At 4 a.m., she gave up and started her race day routine. Plain oatmeal with a measured tablespoon of almond butter, exactly 300 calories to fuel the 13.1 miles ahead. She dressed in her running clothes, each piece chosen through trial and error to minimize chafing and maximize comfort. Her bib went on straight, 4 safety pins exactly, a ritual that calmed her nerves. The starting line was a sea of bodies in the pre-dawn darkness, headlamps and nervous energy, creating an electric atmosphere. She found her corral, the 2:15 pace group, and tried to quiet her mind. This was her third half marathon, but it felt like the first. Every race felt like she was proving something, to herself, to the world, to the ghost of her former self, that sometimes felt more real than her current incarnation. The gun went off, and she began to run, finding her rhythm in the crowd of moving bodies. The first few miles flew by, Austin's downtown streets familiar from hundreds of training runs. She passed the coffee shop, where she'd had her first date with Thomas, the park where she'd cried after her first 5K, the bridge where she'd contemplated giving up entirely one particularly dark evening in year 2. Each landmark was a piece of her story, the geography of her transformation mapped onto the city she'd made her home. Mile 7 brought the hills, and she saw other runners starting to struggle. This was where training showed, where the daily discipline paid off. She maintained her pace, her breathing controlled, her form solid. A spectator held a sign that read, "You're all crazy, and I'm so impressed." And Laura smiled despite herself. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe maintaining a 150-pound weight loss for 5 years required a kind of insanity, a willingness to live in a constant state of vigilance that most people couldn't sustain. At mile 10, she saw them. Thomas's parents and Thomas himself, who'd finished the full marathon in just over 3 hours. They were cheering, holding signs with her name, and she felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Patricia was jumping up and down, shouting, "Go, Laura!" with genuine enthusiasm, and Bill was taking photos, and Thomas was beaming with pride. For a moment, she saw herself through their eyes, not as the former fat girl making good, but as a runner, an athlete, someone worth cheering for. The final miles were always the hardest, when her body wanted to quit and her mind had to take over. This was the part that reminded her most of weight loss maintenance, the point where initial enthusiasm had worn off and only determination remained. She thought about the support group, about Margaret's 15 years of maintenance, about James fighting to stop his regain. She thought about her mother in Brazil, who still didn't understand, but loved her anyway. She thought about Thomas, who'd never known her before but was choosing to know her now. She crossed the finish line in 2:14:37, a personal record by nearly 2 minutes. Thomas was there immediately, wrapping her in a sweaty hug, his parents close behind with congratulations. "That was amazing," Patricia said, and Laura realized she meant it. Not amazing for someone who used to be fat, just amazing. The distinction mattered more than she could express. Later, at the post-race brunch that she'd carefully planned to accommodate both celebration and her nutritional needs, Laura found herself actually enjoying the moment. She ate her egg white omelette with vegetables without apology or explanation, drank her water while others had mimosas, and felt for once at peace with her choices. Thomas's parents shared stories of their own athletic endeavors from decades past, and she realized they saw her as one of them, an athlete, rather than as an anomaly. "You know," Patricia said quietly while the men were getting coffee, "Thomas told us a bit about your journey. I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to say that I think you're incredibly brave, not just for losing the weight, but for keeping it off. My sister lost 100 pounds once and gained it all back within 2 years. I know it's not easy." Laura felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "It's the hardest thing I do every day," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "Harder than the races, harder than work, harder than anything. It's choosing to be this person over and over again, even when I'm tired of choosing." Patricia reached over and squeezed her hand. "But you keep choosing. That's what matters." On the drive home, Thomas was quiet, and Laura worried she'd revealed too much, shown too much of the struggle behind the success. But at a red light, he turned to her. "My mom really likes you. She said you're the real deal, whatever that means." He laughed, but Laura understood. The real deal meant someone who'd earned their fitness, who understood its cost, who knew that transformation wasn't a destination, but a daily decision. That evening, alone in her apartment finally, Laura sat with her finisher's medal and her carefully portioned post-race meal. She opened her laptop and began to write, something she'd been thinking about for months. A blog post, maybe a series, about the reality of long-term weight loss maintenance. Not the inspirational success story people wanted, but the truth that 5 years in, she still thought about food constantly, that she still weighed herself daily, that she still feared regaining. That success looked like running half marathons while calculating calories, like meeting parents while hiding loose skin, like being brave enough to keep choosing this life even when it exhausted her. She wrote about the keys to her success, such as they were: the support group that understood her struggle, the exercise that had become medicine for her mind as much as her body, the careful construction of a life that supported her goals even when it meant saying no to things others took for granted. She wrote about the paradox of transformation, how she'd had to accept her body to change it, then had to keep changing it to maintain it. She wrote about the difference between weight loss, which had an endpoint, and maintenance, which was forever. As she typed, she thought about everyone she'd met on this journey. Margaret, with her 15 years of proof that it was possible. Marcus, who'd become her running partner and confidant. Jennifer, who tried to understand, even when she couldn't fully grasp it. Thomas, who was choosing to love her without having known her before. Her parents, who struggled to recognize this new daughter, but loved her anyway. They were all part of her story, the network that made her success possible. The blog post grew longer, more honest than she'd intended. She wrote about standing in front of the croissants at Whole Foods, about crying in her car after work lunches, about the exhaustion of performing health for others while struggling to maintain it for herself. She wrote about the victory of today's race, how crossing that finish line meant more than just 13.1 miles completed. It was proof that she could do hard things, that she could maintain this transformation even when every day required conscious choice. She titled it, "The Truth About Keeping 150 Pounds Off for 5 Years, and hesitated before hitting publish on the blog she'd created months ago but never used. Then she thought about Sarah from the support group, still in the honeymoon phase, needing to know what lay ahead. She thought about the woman she'd seen at the expo today, easily 300 pounds, looking at the runners with longing and despair. She thought about her former self, searching the internet for stories of people who'd actually kept the weight off, finding only before and after photos that told nothing of the during and the forever after. She hit publish. Within minutes, comments started appearing. Some critical, saying she was obsessive, that this wasn't healthy, that she'd traded one disorder for another. Maybe they were right, but others thanked her for her honesty, for showing that maintenance was work, that success didn't mean easy, that it was okay to struggle and succeed simultaneously. By the time she went to bed, The post had been shared dozens of times, starting conversations she'd been too afraid to have for 5 years. Lying in bed with her medal on the nightstand and her muscles sore from the race, Laura felt something shift. Not a dramatic transformation like the weight loss had been, but a subtle acceptance of what her life had become. She would wake up tomorrow and weigh herself. She would track her food. She would plan her workouts. She would make choices that prioritized her health over convenience, over social ease, over the path of least resistance. This was her life, the price of her transformation, and after 5 years, she was beginning to understand that the key to long-term success wasn't finding a way to make it easy. It was finding meaning in the difficulty, community in the struggle, and identity in the daily choice to remain transformed. The woman who'd stood on the scale 5 years ago at 295 pounds had wanted to disappear. The woman lying in bed at 145 pounds had learned instead to be visible, vulnerable, and honest about the cost of change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new temptations, new reasons to quit. But tonight, she was exactly who she'd fought to become. Imperfect, struggling, maintained, and finally real.